Hi, I'm Diana Giselle Yanez, host of Highly Sensitive Money. I'm a money coach, certified financial planner, and highly sensitive person who brings money and social justice together. I grew up questioning why we have poverty in a world that can provide for everyone. In this show, I chat with highly sensitive people on how they handle money and with money experts on how they cultivate social justice in their work. Join us as we explore money and sensitivity while honoring that all of our well being is connected. In this episode, I'm thrilled to have Laura Gates-Lupton, a financial feminist and money coach who has transformed the lives of countless people by helping them untangle their complex relationship with money. Laura's background as a psychotherapist and her personal journey from a career in social work to coaching on financial matters brings depth to her approach. Laura's work is not just about numbers and spreadsheets. It's about understanding the emotional and psychological barriers that often hinder our financial growth. She believes in the power of authenticity and vulnerability in conversations about money, which is evident in her podcast, Women Uncaged, where she and her co-host, Lynda explore issues facing women with raw honesty, humor, and warmth. So whether you're a solopreneur looking to break free from the cycle of overworking and undercharging, or simply seeking to understand the emotional aspects of your financial life, this episode with Laura Gates-Lupton is a must listen. Join us as we navigate the path to financial empowerment with sensitivity and authenticity. Welcome, Laura. Welcome to Highly Sensitive Money. I'm really excited to have you here and to get to talk to you about money, feminism, sensitivity, all of the things.
Oh, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I've really been looking forward to this.
Thank you. Well, and I would love for you to introduce yourself a bit about like the work that you do now. And then we'll go into the question that I usually open with of like, what was the financial background of your childhood and how does it affect today?
Sure. The work that I do now is primarily with women at midlife who have ignored their money, and then sort of the magical day happens. They don't experience it as magical, but when they realize like, oh, this is not going to get better on its own. Like somehow I thought this would all work out. Somebody else would take care of it, or something a windfall would come along, something like that would clean up this mess. And clearly that's not going to happen, and I need to, but I can't do it on my own. And so they come to me.
Okay. And I can see how that's a story that we're told as women, right? Like
Yep.
don't worry about money, somebody else will take care of it.
Yes.
Do you find that you're working with you said midlife, right? Do you
Mm-hmm.
feel like it's changing generationally? Are like millennials less likely to fall into that? Gen Zs?
I keep hoping that that's true, but the younger women I've been talking to occasionally, that doesn't seem to be true. But the women I work with, my youngest client just turned 44. Most of my
Okay.
clients are in their 50s, and I have a couple in their early 60s. But when I have kids in their 20s, and so sometimes I ask their peers, and sometimes I hear things that are different, but mostly I don't, and I find that very sad.
Well, 2024 is the 50th anniversary of women being able to take out credit on their own.
Yeah.
So it's still pretty new.
It is. And I think we have to remember that, because sometimes we can beat ourselves up around, individually and culturally, around we haven't gotten very far as women with money. But actually, when you point that out, yes, we have. Yes, we have.
Yeah, because 50 years, that's like maybe two generations, right? 2.5 generations. I know my life is very, very different from my grandmother's.
Oh, yes.
It also, yeah.
But even different from my mother's. I don't know about you, but my parents have a very traditional relationship. So it's very different.
So if as much as you're comfortable, I'd love to hear about the financial background of your childhood and how it might impact you and the work that you do today.
Sure. I'll go back a little bit and talk about my parents before I was born. Both of my parents grew up in poverty. My dad was a Depression-era kid. He was born in the 30s. And his dad left the family, and his mom was on her own to fend for 3 kids, and she worked very hard to do so. And thankfully, she was smart, and she actually defied the times in terms of her ability to handle money. And when my grandfather, my father's father, won a pool, he was in the Navy, he won a pool about when they would get back into port in the States. And I don't know how much he won exactly, but my grandmother managed to get her hand on $11,000 and bought a house, which stayed in the family until she died, which was about 20, 30 years ago. But she She was determined to do better for her kids than her husband was. So she, in some ways, is my role model when I think about that kind of determination without the education that we now have the benefit of having. But my dad, having grown up in this situation in which there wasn't enough food, there wasn't enough money, he saw his mom struggle. He was determined that his kids would never have that experience. And I'm sorry, I'm going to get really choked up. But he
Yeah,
worked
take your
so
time.
hard, my dad did, to make sure that we had what we needed. But he kind of took it to the extreme. So he worked 6 days a week and 4 nights a week. We hardly ever saw him. And I like to think about that when I talk with clients because I never want people to go to those kinds of extremes in order to right the wrong. It's like we need to find the middle ground. And I don't particularly like the word balance so much because that implies that we stay in a certain point and we're always sort of teetering in the middle to me. But with my dad, it was all about work. And he used to tell us all the time, like, work's the most important thing. Nothing's more important than work, which is clearly very much a reaction to his father, who just did not work much. He had ventures, he did various things, his dad did, but he was kind of a ne'er-do-well. My mom, on the other hand, grew up the eldest of 9 kids, also in poverty. Her parents divorced when she was young. Her grandmother pulled her out of school to take care of the younger kids. Thankfully, because my mom was smart and she had teachers who cared about her, they made sure she got back in school. And she was lucky in that sense. She had teachers who really looked out for her. So she did graduate high school. She went to nursing school, got married very young. She got married when she was 19 and had me when she was 21. And she, to this day, knows very little about money. My dad has taken care of all of that. So it's very different than how I live my life. And in some ways, I'm a reaction to them. They're a reaction to their childhoods. But when I was growing up, my dad's very much a penny pincher. He saved a ton of money. That's the thing, he cared about having that security and that stability that he didn't have as a kid. So like when we'd want jeans, Dad would give us $2, it's like.
You're like, they're 200, Dad. They're 200.
Well, we grew up near Champion is now like a major clothing brand. But when I was a kid, it wasn't. We grew up near the Champion factory and they had attached to the factory an outlet store. So you could go in and get $2 pair of jeans, but you wouldn't want to wear them. They were like the ones that they didn't want to put on the shelf, So anyway, my dad was a penny pincher and my mom was also very frugal because he gave her a little bit of money to manage for the household every week. And so any money she saved was from that. So one time when I was really little, she came home with a box of cereal, which was not typical. And I was like, "Oh, Mommy, was that on sale?" And she felt really bad. She realized she'd indoctrinated me to realize we were only going to buy things like that if they were on sale.
So she realized that she had taught you that already?
Yeah. Yep. At a very young age. So how that impacted me was that I saw that my dad cared about money more than anything. That's how I interpreted it as a child. He cared about work and money. And so I kind of went in the opposite direction. And I really thought, truly, that you could either love people or you could love money and work. I didn't see it as you could love all those things. What were you going to say?
No, I saw that in your LinkedIn profile, right?
Yeah.
When you think about like what your work is today. And then this brings us to our next question, because your career trajectory has started in one place and moved in many different iterations to where it is now. So it feels like that idea that maybe was underground, you can love money or you can love people, had to have a shift.
Oh, it absolutely did. And I decided, I had a therapist when I was a teenager who was amazing. I'm so grateful for her because she was the one person when I was a teen who really saw me for me, and who really encouraged me to embrace my ideas that were different from my parents. And encouraged me to leave high school a year early, which I did. I left after my junior year and went to college. She kept saying, like, you're ready for more, you can do this. And I had her and 2 teachers in my corner who were all like, yep, you should just go. And so that was really wonderful and changed a lot for me. But when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, I realized, I want to be like her. So I ended up going to the same grad school she went to get my degree in clinical social work. I never really looked at the price tag. Like all I cared about was I wanted to do what she had done, which is to deeply see and serve people. And I cared a lot about my relationships with my friends and my family, but I just didn't pay any attention to the money. And I'll tell you, I am still paying student loans to this day.
Wow.
Yeah. And part of that is because I have kids in college and I'm paying the minimum on mine because I don't want them to have loans. And I've had kids in college for a number of years now. So I could have had them paid off if I didn't prioritize my kids. But I just don't want them to be held back in the way that I felt held back by having so many student loans. I didn't have any help from family. And the the price tag was in the 60,000s. It was a very expensive school. And I just didn't even consider that. All I thought about was, I'm going to have this career where I'm going to help people. And I knew I'd be good at it, and I was. But I just didn't think about the consequences of that at all.
Well, and it sounds like there's very deep money avoidance too.
Oh, sure.
Right. And I don't imagine that in social work school, they're telling you, like, let's talk about your emotional relationship to money. Not at all.
Never. We never talked about money. And I don't know if it's different now, but we never talked about money. We never talked about how do you talk about your fees with your clients. We talked about how to be of service, how to best help people, and all the intricacies of that. And there's a lot to that. And it was a very intense and rigorous program. And I went out. So the program I went to, you go for 10 weeks on campus. Then they send you out to an internship for a year. I went to Philadelphia for the first year. And I went to school in Massachusetts. Then you go back for 10 weeks for school. And then you go out again. And I was in Cincinnati the second year. And then you go back for 10 weeks. And in the second year, you're writing a master's thesis. In all that time, in the internships, in the coursework, nobody ever talked about money.
Yeah. And did you think about going to your parents and asking them about money or the cost, or it was just completely out of mind, out of sight?
The hard part, so my mom really doesn't know much about money, and my dad always acted as if we should just know. He was really hard to approach our money. Now, that has shifted as he's gotten older, but when I was younger, it was really hard to talk about money with Dad, and it was very hard to ask for money. I ended up at one point having to ask him for $11,000 because I literally had a bill I couldn't pay, and I thought I wasn't going to be able to finish school. And he did. He loaned me that money. But it was hard to ask. But I tried asking him a few times about things. Like I asked him, because he was a real estate investor. And at one point later in life, I asked him, like, what could you tell me about getting involved in investing in real estate? And he said, don't do it.
Very clear guidance. No.
No subtlety there. So yeah, I wished I'd had the kind of relationship where I could have gone to them and talked about it. But by the time I realized the hole I was digging, it was A, too late, B, I felt stupid, and C, I was not going to parade that in front of my parents.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the things about, like, I think about money, I think about sex, topics that we're supposed to know something about, but that we never talk about. And then there's shame because you're confused. Like, yeah.
Yeah. I remember my parents came just before I graduated. The president of the college had a tea for all the graduating students. And we were in our own separate program, so it was just us graduating, just the clinical social workers. And my parents came to the garden party where the tea was, and my dad was walking around talking to everybody. And at the end of the night, he said to me, "You're the only one that has a job to go to. None of your friends have jobs." And I said, "Oh, I know, but I only have 2 weeks worth of money to live on, so I had to get a job." He was like, "Oh, okay, good." That was the extent of it.
Well, I mean, that also speaks to, like, the motivation that you had.
Well, part of it is I'd been living on my own since 17, and at that point I was 24 and I wasn't going back. My parents had said, if you need to come home for a while, you can. But I thought, oh God, no. I have been out way too long, And they live in a tiny town that I didn't grow up in, and I'd been in 2 cities at that point, and I wanted more than that. I didn't want to be in this little town where, I don't really fit in anyway.
Yeah. And I think, I imagine, like, your story relates so much to what your clients may be experiencing, right? Like, if they're women in midlife who are coming to a point where you were 24 when you were starting to realize what hole you were in.
Yes. Yes, but absolutely. I just did it a little bit earlier, but I can so relate to where they're at and the feeling that they have. They look around and they think everybody else has it figured out because we don't talk about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
You assume your neighbors have it all figured out. They've got a nice house. They've got a nice car. They seem to be doing fine. And so you think it's just you. And I can so relate to that feeling because that's how I felt. It seems like
Yeah.
nobody else was so stupid to take these huge loans, right?
Yeah, yeah. My story with college is really, really different, but a lot of it was luck.
Mm-hmm.
Like really big luck. My parents got divorced right before I went into college, so my mom's income was very, very low as a head of household. I had really good grades. I'm very like academic. If academia weren't so publish or perish, I'd still be in school. Like I love books. So I was just primed for it. And living in California at the time when I was going to college was very generous in their financial aid if you had merit. So but I didn't really realize that until I moved. I lived in Philadelphia for a while. And when I
Oh,
was in
cool.
Pennsylvania, I was asking people about what college was like there. And it was a very different experience. Right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. My parents tried to help me a little bit with college. They didn't help at all with grad school. But part of the problem was my dad was in business for himself, so his business income would fluctuate wildly.
Mm-hmm.
So there were a couple years where I got no financial aid at all because he made so much money, and they weren't really helping me. They would help a little bit with, like, if I said, I need money for groceries, they would throw a little money my way, but they weren't paying tuition or anything like that. So that was really hard. I actually almost got married in college. I was dating a guy, and he tried to convince me to marry him because if I had, I could have filed independently or applied independently for financial aid, and I probably would have had a full ride. But I didn't want to make that choice, and I'm glad I didn't. But
I
it's
have a friend that made that choice. She
yeah,
did get married because she knew it would help her financially for college. Isn't that? It just it's so infuriating. That's part of why when I talk about money on this podcast, I bring in the systems that we're in, right? Because
yep,
social justice includes like all of us doing well and people getting married in order to get that's ridiculous. It's so outrageous, as is the fact that like the majority of bankruptcies are because of medical debt. It's
right.
just these things that they're so broken. And then as people, we're expected to know how to navigate them without ever talking about them.
Right. And the thing is, it's not just about getting married. I mean, that is crazy that you'd think you'd have to do that to pay for college. But once you're married, there are other things that happen. You could end up having kids. You can end up feeling very trapped. It can be a decision that you made to support yourself for college, but then you end up, have this lifelong situation that you didn't necessarily want to have. So it has its own ramifications.
Yeah. So for anyone that's thinking maybe getting married is the way to pay for college, there's a lot of other.
I would never recommend it. I would never recommend it. I worked a lot of jobs. I worked very hard to get through college, and I'm proud of that, although I'm also annoyed that I had to do it sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, for myself, it's like I didn't recognize at the time what a gift I was receiving until much later on. And I'm still really grateful for it. And it wasn't like anyone had planned anything out. I just happened to be born there. My parents happened to have the income that they did because they had pretty high incomes 5 years earlier, right? Things could have been so different.
Yeah.
So coming back to your career trajectory from the research that I did on, you were in social work, you worked in adoption, you were a therapeutic foster parent,
Yep.
you were a book coach, now a money coach. What are some of the threads that you see weaved through all of that work?
Yeah, well, the first I was a psychotherapist. So that's when I graduated, that's what I graduated to do. And I did that for quite a while. And I had a private practice and I had a job. I always had a job and a half because I was paying student loans. So, and then I got tired of having two jobs. So I started a private practice so I could at least be my own boss in one place in my life. And so I realized the work that I mostly was hired to do was working with kids and families. But when I started the private practice, I realized how much I loved working with adult women. That was my first experience with that. And I'd been seeing adults as parents, but it was all focused on the kids, and that's very different from seeing women about their own issues. So that was my first taste of that. And that was when I was living in Rhode Island, which is where I went right after I graduated from grad school. And I just loved working with them. And they were, for the most part, way older than I was at the time. I was still in my 20s. But getting a taste of what their lives were like And particularly because I'd always been interested in feminism and family systems and that kind of thing. But when you're reading about it and studying about it, it's completely different from having a woman in your office who's telling you what her life is like. And that was really eye-opening for me. I didn't end up transitioning to fully working with women until much later, but that has always stayed with me. So as you said, I ended up working in adoption, but I worked in special needs adoption. So our mission at Adoption Rhode Island was to find permanent homes for kids in foster care. So that's what we were doing. And that was the place where I learned I had so many skills beyond just the one-on-one work, because we were doing all of the media. I was writing columns for a newspaper. I was on TV. I was on radio. We had a spot that's still running today on WJAR in Providence, Rhode Island, called Tuesday's Child. And it was responsible for getting the kid who would be on that spot every week and writing up the outline for that and getting it to the news people who would, and then being there when they were filming it too. So I got to know them really well. It was really fun. And they were such wonderful people to work with, I have to say. But I got to do so many things that were different and outside of the realm of traditional social work, including working hard with the people who were in social work, the caseworkers who had the caseload for whom we were trying to find families for those kids, and working with the prospective adoptive parents and having them come in and trying to match them with kids. So I loved that job. It was so much fun, and it was very rewarding, but it was also heartbreaking because there were some kids we did not find families for.
Yeah, I did a very, very brief stint in social work as like an assistant social work, a peer mentor.
Mhm.
And after a year and a half, I was like, I don't think I have the empathetic boundaries or the skill set to do this type of work. So working with foster kids sounds like it would have been really emotionally difficult at times.
It was really hard. And the way I became a foster parent was that right after I started that job, I was looking through the files in my office and I saw the name of a kid that I recognized because she had been my client years earlier. She was 7 when I saw her before. She was 11 at the time that I saw her name in the file. And I called her caseworker to ask what happened to her, because I knew her parents' parental rights had been terminated around the time that I had seen her when she was little. And the social worker or the caseworker said, I can't believe you're calling me today, but she's about to go to night placement, meaning that they didn't even have a foster family for her. She was going to go into placement where she would go to a different place every night. And I couldn't believe it. And I'm like, why did she never get adopted? Well, somehow she'd fallen through the cracks. And so she had, at that point, been in 8 foster families.
Wow.
And it was just heartbreaking. And my husband and I had been coworkers at the time in the same agency, and he had seen her brothers in therapy, and I had seen her for a very brief period of time, because she got placed in a foster family that lived too far away, so they couldn't bring her to see me anymore. So I didn't see her for long at all, but I always remembered her. And then to find out she was going to night placement, I was devastated. And I went into my boss's office, my new boss. I'd been there like 6 weeks, and burst into tears and was like, I can't believe this is happening to this particular kid. And we talked about it, and he said, yeah, I mean, I'm afraid this happens all the time. I get that it's more personal because it's someone you know, but we see this all the time. And then I went home that night and said to my husband, I just don't think I can let this happen. So I reached out to the caseworker the next day and said, would you consider us? And she said yes. So 3 weeks later, a week after our first wedding anniversary, we suddenly had an 11-year-old daughter.
A week after your wedding anniversary.
Yes. We were like celebrating our anniversary, and what we were doing that day was like painting her room because we wanted to make the room nice for her. We'd scrapped our original plans to go away for the day. We were going to go to Cape Cod, but we instead got her room ready.
Wow. And then I remember when I had clients who were agoraphobic, they were afraid to leave their home, and like I wanted to bring them home with me.
Yeah.
You know, it's like it's that kind of empathetic overwhelm that now learning about being highly sensitive. I don't know if you identify as highly sensitive. You do. It's beautiful to have this higher sensitivity to people, and also like how do you manage it when there's so much pain in the world?
Right. At the time, I didn't realize I was highly sensitive. You know, I knew that I was like a sponge around other people, but I thought that was a problem that I had. I didn't realize that I was highly sensitive. And it's only been in the last, I don't even know, 5 or 6 years that I've come back around to seeing myself as highly sensitive, because what happened was that all got drummed out of me It's like, because you can't keep doing the work when you feel that way if you don't have some tools. And I didn't have any tools. So I had to shut that part down. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm growing up around this. It doesn't bother me so much anymore. I'm becoming more mature. That's what I thought. It wasn't until a few years ago, like probably about 5 years ago, when I started to think about it a little bit differently. And I started to wonder, like, wait, maybe I just like cut off part of myself. And then I ended up working with a coach a few years ago who was brilliant and really helped me to see that, like, oh, yeah, this is a lovely part of you that you should bring back online.
Yeah, I know. It's like I also learned for many years, like how to be numb.
Mm-hmm.
That was when I look back, I was like, that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to be like other people who did not have that sensitivity.
Yeah. And I don't know for you how you interpreted it, but I just thought they were more mature than me.
Yeah, when I first heard the term, and it came from a few different people over a few years, the first time I was like, I don't know that I was rude, but I was kind of offended. Like
Mm.
sensitive is feminine, it's weak, things I don't want to be, even though I am a very feminine woman. But it felt like I was being told to be stronger,
Yes.
right? So,
Yes. And as a kid, my dad's nickname for me was Waterworks because I would burst
mhm.
into tears all the time. And I had two younger brothers. I was the only daughter in the household. I do have an older sister, but she didn't live in our house with us. She's my half sister. And it was, definitely not cool to cry and be so sensitive.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the gifts of sensitivity is that sometimes you have clear sight on
Yes.
things that other people don't want to see. So it's a lot of like shoot the messenger. I know my
Yes.
family really did not enjoy my questions. It was just
Oh, you and I have a lot in common. I got a lot of trouble for asking things that I wasn't supposed to be asking, and in part because
Mhm.
I've always been highly intuitive too. So sometimes I just knew things, like, for example, I didn't grow up knowing I had a sister. I didn't find out till I was 16 about her. But I used to write these stories. I used to tell everybody I had a sister. I would going around telling everybody
Wow.
that I had a sister, and I would write stories and give them to my teachers and show them to my parents and all of that stuff. And then when I did find out I actually did have a sister, my father had a daughter, I said to him, "Didn't I drive you crazy?" And he said, "Oh, I don't remember that."
I guess sometimes you just don't want to see stuff,
Hmm.
right? Like where
Yeah.
people can be really good at that.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned that feminism, and I know when we first had our initial conversation, like feminism is a core part of your work. And I
Yes.
actually, like, I've never studied feminism. I imagine that I
Mm.
identify with a lot of it, but I'd love to hear like your understanding of it. And I also want to bring in like another term that's really common right now is intersectionality,
Hmm.
right? Of like how you think about age, how you think about race, class.
Oh, I think it's all related. I think the definition of feminism that I first learned in college, I took Intro to Feminism when I was freshman in college, which was supposed to be only for juniors and seniors, but I snuck my way into the class. And the definition I learned there that it was about equality between the sexes, socially, politically, economically, which is a great start. But, I'm a mom of transgender kids. I don't see it as male and female. We have a number of genders. And also, we did not talk about the impact of we were talking about primarily white women. White women, nobody said that in the class. They weren't saying we're studying white women. But when I look back, we were pretty much white, middle class American women. And there's so much more to us than that, right? It's like there's ableism, there's ageism, there's transphobia, there's homophobia. There are all these other things that intersect. It's not just about feminism. And even within feminism, as a definition, I think we also need to center women's experiences and value what they bring to the table, which that original definition leaves out. And I think that's true for all these groups of people that we're talking about. It's like when we're ageist, we're discounting the value of older people, and that discrimination, we're somehow devaluing them. It's the same kind of thing that we do with women all the time. And I think, like, instead of equality so much around now, like, instead of striving for equality, we should, yes, absolutely. But it shouldn't be limited to that. It should be more about eradicating misogyny. And I think that that's true around all the other quote unquote isms, that it isn't just about the positive movement toward equality. It's about getting rid of that underlying, those biases that we have that we often don't even see. like bringing those to the table, getting those out.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense to you?
It does. One of the ways that I think a lot about these different isms that we work with is like oppression.
Mm-hmm.
How do we move beyond oppression? What does it look like for us to be in solidarity, to be supporting each
Yep.
other? And I also think always like how the patriarchy really hurts everyone. It doesn't
It
just hurt
does.
women. It really limits men's experiences too.
It absolutely does, because it limits who they can be, right? It's like I see that with my own kids around gender issues and trying to figure out, like I've watched them go through this period of trying to figure out who they are in terms of gender. And part of it is there's such a limited definition for what a man is and for what a woman is. And I see this too with, I do work with male clients. I don't have as many of them as I do women. I see it with them as well, just trying to figure that out. What does it mean to be a nurturing father if you're also standing in being a man? We don't give people a lot of room for that.
So we've talked about what feminism is and a little bit about moving in a direction that's anti-oppression in
Yes.
all of the different isms and expanding how people experience gender.
Yep.
When you're working with people and the topic of money, how do you bring it in? Because I know for money, I mean, we were talking about this at the beginning. We have very like clear stories about what a woman is with money and what a man
Mm-hmm.
is with money. Whether the stories are said out loud, whether they are culturally appropriate, like how do you work with that?
I mean, a lot of it is as women are talking with me, just pointing out sometimes that the concerns and the fears that they have are really the patriarchy in their head. I mean, that happens a lot. So, for example, around negotiating, I help women negotiate money all the time, like whether they're getting a new job or they're negotiating for a raise or things like that. And a lot of times they just don't want to have the conversation. And part of that is that disempowerment that the patriarchy tells us to shut up, right? To be quiet. And so just even identifying that some of their experience can be helpful because we internalize it and think it's something wrong with us. So pointing out that, no, actually, this is the water that you're swimming in. Like you've explicitly been told you shouldn't be asking for money. You shouldn't be asking for anything, right? Like as women. So, but especially money, especially money. And you're going to be seen, this is what we're told, you're going to be seen as a bitch. You're going to be seen as pushy. You're going to be seen as somebody who's unattractive, just by virtue of asking for money. And so I love to point out those cultural pieces and what we've grown up with to women to help destigmatize how they're feeling and also to normalize that this is going to be uncomfortable. You were not raised to do this. And so, because a lot of times I'll hear from women, well, I really want to ask for a raise, but I want to wait till I'm ready. I want to wait till I'm comfortable. I want to wait. And if you wait till then, you're going to be at your retirement party thinking, I never asked for a raise. But part of it is the understanding of why it's uncomfortable. It's not uncomfortable because there's something wrong with you. It's uncomfortable because you've explicitly been told you should not have this conversation you're about to have.
So when you're having this conversation, coaching people through asking for the raise,
Mhm.
it's one thing to understand it kind of like in your head, but how do you actually like bring it into your heart or like work with it? How do you embody this new sense of empowerment?
One of the ways I have women do it, and because I work with women at midlife, this works. If they were younger, this would not necessarily. I have them literally write out all the things they bring to the table, everything. And if they've been in the job for a while, there are a lot of skills that they've picked up at the job. There's institutional knowledge. There are all kinds of things. It can come from previous jobs. It can come from any kind of experience. And I've yet to have a woman come back to the next meeting with me and say, that wasn't powerful. It's like they're always like, I did not realize how much value I had until I did this exercise. And then we talk about it. And then we talk about like what it means in terms of what she's going to ask for and how to truly stand in that value. And you're right, it is hard to embody, but it's a lot easier when you've spent time writing it all out and really seeing it. Not even some of the value we bring isn't so tangible, but I have them write everything down, whatever it is, whether it's like
Mhm.
I'm the best listener on the team, something like that, or I landed that contract 2 months ago that brought in this much money. So it's both. It's the practical and the less
Mhm.
obvious.
Yeah, it's the numbers oriented, but it's also like your way of being on the team, like the
Yes.
things that we're doing that. And I mean, there's so many things that that women are asked to do without ever being asked to do them, like kind of being like the facilitator, the mediator, like communicating between different people. It often, and I remember hearing this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but I remember learning that women, because when we're young, we're often socialized to be more focused on communication.
Yes.
Women are expected to talk more, so our communication develops more quickly than
Yes.
it does for people who are gendered as men. So you're
I totally
right.
agree with you.
So when we go into work, we start doing these things very, very naturally. And often there's also this thing that because it comes easily to me, it must not really be work, or it must really not be worth it.
Right. Right. And if you see, like, say, for example, if there's a man at work who keeps his head down and doesn't interact with other people and he works really hard, you can internalize that as that's how I'm supposed to be. So I should probably shut up. I should probably stop talking to everybody. But everybody comes to me when they're having a problem, right? Like, they come to me when they're having a problem with each other. The boss comes to me to say, "Oh, I'm really stuck here." Like, and so they have this internal struggle around, like, I should probably be more like him over there. But yet, this is what people are coming to me for. And we tend to look at that negatively instead of like, oh, well, I happen to have a gift he doesn't have. We almost never do that, right? It's like, instead, we see it as like, I'm not doing the kind of work that we're supposed to here. I don't fit in the way that other people expect me to. That's what I hear from women anyway that I work with, is they tend to internalize those things as somehow negative instead of seeing what you just said, which is that they're experienced and they have gifts around communication. And when people are coming to you, you're probably very empathetic and you probably have good advice.
And those are things that we need to give ourselves credit for, even if they come, even when they come naturally. All of it needs to be accounted for. I love that exercise.
Yeah. I think especially if they come naturally, we should give ourselves credit for them, because those are the gifts that we're brought into the world with, and like maybe we've been honed over time, but we didn't start from zero necessarily. And we, for whatever reason, we tend to discount the things that come easily to us. And I think we should embrace them.
Yeah. So for all the highly sensitive people listening to this, right? Like embrace your sensitivity. I love when I first learning about this concept, they talk about like it being kind of like the canary in the coal mine,
Yes.
right? HSPs being the first ones to tell when there's something toxic going on.
Yep. Yep. And it's absolutely true. And when I was a family therapist, I would see it in families. Usually the kid who was brought in to therapy first was the canary in the coal mine. Very rarely was the kid the problem, right? He just was the one, or she was the one who was acting out in the family or in school, and was the one who was like, okay, they'd bring this child in saying, like, basically fix this child.
Mm-hmm.
But rarely was it the child's issue.
That makes a lot of sense from what I understand about family systems.
Yeah.
So, continuing with the theme of feminism, you have a wonderful podcast that it was a joy to listen to, Women Uncaged. Can you share like how that got started and more about like you and Lynda Katz?
Sure. Well, I mentioned just a little while ago that I had a wonderful coach who helped me when I was trying to, embrace my sensitive side. Well, that was Lynda Katz. She's amazing. She's absolutely amazing. And she and I have been friends for like 4.5 years. And we've had various iterations of our relationship. It's grown over time, but we've hired each other for various things and and spent a lot of time together online, only in person this year, finally. But up till now, it was all online. Up till recently.
That must have been really exciting to meet each other in person, to see like, how tall are you?
That was you're so funny you should say that, because I walked into Lynda's house in January and hugged her, and I was like, "You're not as tall as I thought you would be." That was the first thing I said to her. I'm actually flying down there a day after tomorrow to spend more time with her. But yeah, so Lynda and I just have connected in so many different ways. She's younger than I am. We're very different in some ways, but we have a great connection, and we've talked a lot about issues facing women. But in our work is very different, but we both see it in our work. And we would just have these really great conversations. And at one point we were like, well, maybe we should start recording these. We weren't sure exactly what we were going to do, but we started talking about that. And eventually we thought, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to record 4 conversations and see if we like them. So we did that. We recorded 4. And with the intention of, we called it a podcast, but we didn't know if it would actually ever go anywhere. And then we listened back to, we let them sit for a few weeks, and then we listened back to them, and we were like, this is actually pretty good. I was not wanting to listen to them. I have to admit, I think it was my idea to do it this way, but I thought, I don't know how this is going to be. But we each took 2. We had 4 episodes. We each took 2 to listen to. And we both came back saying, yeah, let's do this. Let's make this a podcast. And so now we're on season 2. And I love Lynda. I love that we can just get on and have conversations. We do not plan anything ahead of time. We get on and we're like, what are we going to talk about today? We decide on a topic and we just go. We don't edit. We don't filter. We're just starting to have guests now. So that's changing things up a little bit, and that's fun. But mostly it's just Lynda and me. And I just love the conversations. I love what we explore. And I love that we can be really vulnerable around these issues together. And in a way, it feels safer to do it together.
Yeah, that's one of the beauties about podcasting because people who are listening are selecting to listen to it, right? So you feel like you have this permission from the person who's listening and also an invitation to bring authenticity.
Yeah.
And to have a little bit more context, you work with people and money. What does Lynda work with?
Lynda primarily works with women. She calls herself a wild feminine life coach. And
Wow.
so she works with women and usually in 2 different kinds of phases. Women who are really burned out, like they've just had so much responsibility at work, at home, and all the things, and they just feel burned out. They feel like something's got to give. They feel stuck, right? And that's where I was when I hired Lynda. I felt very trapped, very stuck. So she works with those women. And then the other group of women she works with are women who want to put something creative out in the world. For example, they want to put a book out. Like they're maybe writing it, but they're struggling with it, like especially a memoir. They're struggling with the idea of these words getting out in front of other people at the same time that they desperately want them to. So she works with those women as well.
And when you hired Lynda, was it the transition between book coach and money coach? Or
No.
do you want to share anything about that?
Sure. I met Lynda when I was transitioning to a money coach. We were both in Tad Hargrave's mentorship program. That's where we met. It was Tad
marketing for hippies, right?
Yep. At the time, he had a mentorship. He had 12 people in it at a time. And Lynda and I were 2 of the 12. And that's when I transitioned from coaching writers to moving to money coaching. Tad helped me do that. So Lynda got to watch me go through that transition. But no, I hired her when I was working a part-time job, which I really did love, but I also felt like it just wasn't what I wanted to be doing. I was also coaching on the side, homeschooling my kids. My marriage was in a difficult place. I had all these things going on, and I just felt like I couldn't give any one of those things up. Like I just felt stretched too thin and really stuck, and like there were no possible solutions at all. And she was the perfect soft place to land for me, where I could go in and talk with her about any of this stuff. And she's just such a gifted listener. And I say this with most of my friends are therapists and they're very good listeners. So I'm used to it. I have a high standard for listening. But Lynda is an incredible listener and she's so intuitive. And she's also a dream wizard. And I dream a lot. So I'd bring my dreams to her and our interpretations were so helpful. She just really helped me to break through the inner cages. And we all talk about the outer cages, which is like our, jobs and marriages and things like that. She helped me bust through my own beliefs and the things I was doing to hold myself back so that it enabled me. I did quit the job. I did leave the marriage. I did launch my kids. And now I have a totally different life. I actually moved 500 miles away from where I was living. But I don't think I could have done it with the joy and the grace that I have done it without Lynda's help, because she helped me work on the inner stuff and the deeper stuff first before it's not a burn it all down kind of thing, which is, of course, when you're feeling stuck and trapped, that's kind of the fantasy, just kind of burn it all down. But it's not necessarily sustainable and it doesn't necessarily serve people over time. I think that's a really long-winded answer to your question.
No, that's beautiful. That gives us a lot of insight into what Lynda's work was and the transformation that you've gone through in the past few years.
Yeah. Yeah. And Lynda is also highly sensitive. So working with her around that, having her help me get in touch with more of those deeper feelings, because I think part of the problem when you're feeling so trapped and stuck is that those feelings are really painful. That canary in the coal mine within ourselves, the thing that wakes you up at 3 or 4 in the morning and you lay there and you're like, oh, I just feel awful. It's like, that's really hard. And it's hard to wrestle with on your own, but having somebody who's willing to hear it all is really, really helpful, and to help you interpret it all too.
That's so lovely. I'm so glad that that you had that experience, that soft landing.
Yeah, me too. Me too. The funny thing is that I wanted to hire Lynda for about a year before I did. And part of it was holding me back, and she's so much younger than I am. And I thought, well, she's so young. How could she, but she's a wise soul. I'm so glad I finally got through that limiting belief that I had around age, which is kind of ridiculous.
Especially because you were very young as a therapist working with older women, and then you didn't want to, whatever there was there that didn't want to be on the other side of it.
It's true. It's true. Even when I was a younger therapist, I always felt a little bit, because I've always looked younger than I am too. And so part of me, I'd always dress very professionally. Part of me always felt like I had something to defend around that a little bit. So that was always a part of it. And that just came out in a different way with Lynda, kind of in a reverse way.
Yeah. Well, one of again, when I was learning about how to do well as an HSP, they often recommend to spend time with other HSPs. So it makes sense that you and Lynda had a very good connection.
Yes.
Do you see that a lot of your clients identify as HSP or have some type of neurodivergence?
Some do. Some do. I think part of the work that we do together is also bringing that out. Like, people come to me, they don't necessarily identify that way, but over time they start to more. There's a certain hardening that women end up doing just to survive that I've come to realize I wasn't the only one doing that. I see that a lot with my clients, that particularly when they have dreams that they'd like to fulfill that require money to some extent, and they feel like that's never going to happen. There's some hardening that can happen there. So I don't always see the people. It's not that they come in saying, I'm highly sensitive and I want to work with you. It's more that is uncovered over time. But I definitely see that.
And that hardening, I listen a lot to Tara Brach. She's a Buddhist teacher out of DC, out of Bethesda. And she talks about how our culture kind of requires it, right? Yes. It requires that we all have this hard shell to protect us from each other, and that then can become a cage.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And I do hear, I know for myself, I labeled it as maturity, but I do see other people doing that as well, calling it maturity.
When another word could be callousness,
yes.
Right?
Yes. Yeah, and the thing for me was that I never totally got rid of my sensitivity, So when I was a therapist, and the last therapist job that I had, which was before I became a coach, this was 13 years ago when I finally left that job, I would see 7 clients in a row. I worked in an agency, and by the end of that, just be like a sponge, like just a limp rag, and I'd go home to my kids and they'd be like, Mommy, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I have nothing left to give. And so I would get in the tub after the kids went to bed. My husband would go to bed. I'd get in the tub and cry. So it wasn't that I totally got rid of my sensitivity, but it was I would just cry. I would think about all the things people told me in the course of the day and all the things that they were grappling with, and I would sob. That was how I
coped. I stopped reading the news unless it's specifically related to the stock market and my work as an investment manager, because it'll take me out. If I'm too in touch with the violence of the world, and it for a while, it did feel like, oh, I'm not doing my civic responsibility by being informed. And at the other end of it, I'm wiped out just from reading how horrible we are to each other.
Right. Right. Yeah. I actually, for quite about 2.5 years, I was a sex abuse treatment and assessment and treatment specialist for the state of Rhode Island. And I realized I had to stop doing that work or I would never be able to have children. Because for exactly the same reason, it just made me look at the world like everybody's a predator. It completely warped the way I was looking at things and felt about things. And I thankfully woke up enough to realize, I don't want this. I was in my 20s, but I do not want my life to be focused on this particular issue. Is it important and does it need to be addressed? Yes, but I did not want to be the one dealing with it all day, every day.
Everybody has different gifts, right? So what you were talking about earlier about what skills, innate skills you already have, there may be some people who don't have that sensitivity, or for whatever reason, they're able to manage it in a way that's not wiping them out.
Yes. Yeah, and I've certainly met people like that. I met somebody recently who was saying, like, no, this is her life's mission. And she was really fired up about it. And I love that. I love knowing there were those people out there. I'm not one of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, giving ourselves fully permission to be who we are. Yes.
Yes.
I would love to hear some details about the work that you do with clients as a money coach. Because like on my end, I'm a certified financial planner. So often we go into like the technical aspects of it. I imagine with your background and all the years that you worked in different therapeutic ways and also with the book coaching, I'm just curious to see, how do you specifically work with people?
I do a lot of inner work. I'm sure that doesn't surprise you. It isn't so much about the technical stuff. We do talk about practicalities for sure. But a lot of the women, when they come to me, they've tried to read various personal finance books and they feel demoralized because they weren't useful. They feel like they failed as a student. And a lot of the women who come to me are like typical sort of good students. They want to please the teacher kind of thing. And that's their history. And they bring that to trying to learn about money. And then so they feel terrible. They feel like, oh, I tried to read this. I tried to listen to Dave Ramsey, or I tried to read his books and it just didn't help me. And there must be something wrong with me. But I think it's really that we aren't addressing the core issues, like a lot of the money issues around, a lot of the money wounds, for example. So I start with a two-pronged approach with most women that I work with. One is talking about her background and her history and excavating some of those wounds and those things. And at the same time, we focus right away on making more money. And the reason we do both at the same time is I have found that if you start focusing on making more money, it's going to bring up all those limiting beliefs and all those wounds in a way that we don't have to dig for them necessarily. So even like, for example, if somebody comes to me around and they're saying their primary thing is that they want to negotiate a different job or a different, structure at work in terms of their pay, we'll do both at the same time. It's like we're going to get into some of that inner work too, because then she does leave the work with me, not just having the skills to negotiate, but feeling differently about where she stands with money. And I think that's so important. I never want to just be skills-based because I think that can only take you so far. And I'm sure you see the same thing in your work where people are trying to learn these concepts and they want to do well with their money, but they're struggling, and you can tell that something's holding them back. I'm imagining. I want to know if that's true.
Yes, definitely. And I look at like, what are the family patterns that they may have had? What did they learn unconsciously that they're recreating? And I really am impressed by the idea, by your take on like having them focus on making more money will bring up all of the resistance, right? All of the feelings of not enoughness.
Yes. Yeah, and I know that in the past, I thought that we should work on the inner work. Like I had this concept. It wasn't until I got in working with women around money that I realized, oh, this is completely wrong. I had this concept in my head that we would focus first on the inner work and we'd do that for a period of time. And then we'd move more into the practical application of trying to make more money. But I realized actually, if you do both at the same time, it's much more powerful.
Mm-hmm. I work a lot with people on cash flow. That's often where we start because they're coming in with debt issues. And I help them think about like, how do you structure your finances so that you feel more peace around them? How do you structure your cash flow?
Yes.
And I see a lot of resistance there, right? A lot of like, well, I really deserve this or I need this because I'm so burnt out from my work. Well, what could we do so that you wouldn't be so burnt out from your work? Or what are other things that you could do? How are other ways that you can take care of yourself?
Yeah.
And making more money, that's a place where like, I need to focus more on doing that for myself, probably. Because one thing I've heard about coaches, healers, anything in that sense is that we can only take people as far as we've gone ourselves.
Right. Right. I think that's true to some extent. On the other hand, I will admit I am much better at helping other people make money than I am at helping myself. Because I can see in other people so clearly what's holding them back and the gifts that they have that they're not necessarily using. And I can't see that necessarily in myself. So I do agree that it's not, I would never tell somebody I'm going to take you to six figures because I'm not at six figures, I would never do that. But I am very good at helping people make more money when I sometimes struggle with it myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Healer, heal thyself only goes so far. And also that's why it's so important for us to have our own coaches, our own way of supporting each other and seeing those blind spots.
Yes. I'm working with Selena Sue right now, who's a great coach, and she makes seven figures. She's way ahead of me, but that's why I'm working with her and her team. to up my own money game, so I am constantly working on myself. And I never want to pretend that I'm further ahead than I am, I am ahead of my clients in lots of ways, but sometimes they out earn me. I will admit it. Like, they work with me and they out earn me.
And it could be different fields. And there's so many, for myself,
That's the
there's
other
so many
thing.
ways to measure compensation. Because I think
Yes.
about the income number, and I also think about the flexibility I have with my time. And I think about the joy that I have with the work that I do and the impact. Similarly to when you would recommend that people, when they're looking at getting a raise, they write down all of the things, both numbers wise and otherwise. In those ways, I know that had I stayed in corporate America, my income would be higher. But outside of corporate America, in this endeavor as an entrepreneur focusing on social justice, my life feels so good.
Yeah, I think
Right.
that's so important. And I see that as true wealth. Like, that's how I think about it, is that we all need to create for ourselves what our vision of true wealth is. And money's a little piece of that. And you just beautifully described the other pieces.
One of the limiting beliefs that I struggle with around income is the sense of like guilt that not everyone has it. Right? Because my parents are immigrants, and part of my money story, like my earliest money memories, are recognizing that there was that discrepancy because I was born in one country versus the rest of my family born in a different one. And I see how I hit that limit still. I'm open for any coaching that you might want to give me, full transparency. or how you've seen this work in other people.
Oh, I've seen it in lots. I think women in general, whether they come from an immigrant background, I mean, most of us have immigrants in our past at some point, at least in the States. But whether we're close to that or not, most of us have some sense of like guilt around, even if it's our siblings, but it could be people in our neighborhood, or it could be people in our city, or just knowing that we're better off than other people. We can have tremendous guilt around that. So I guess the question I would ask you is, how can you embrace what you have and still serve the people that you're concerned that somehow you're hurting with what you have?
I'll take that one to my journal. I'll journal on it. How can I embrace what I have and still serve the people that I want to serve?
Yeah. And also, I would ask yourself the question, how are you hurting them by having what you have?
Thank you. One of the ways that I've been kind of navigating this question when it comes up for me is just imagining that there's a world where everybody has what I have.
Yes.
That everybody has adequate housing, shelter, that they can take time off, that they enjoy their work like that. Imagining that to be possible is really what helps me kind of own it for myself.
Yeah, I think that's lovely.
And
I would also invite you to imagine the opposite. No, for you personally, what if you didn't have any of it? What if you gave it all away?
I feel a lot of constriction just imagining.
Well, and think about where you'd land. Where you would land if you gave it all away, would that help anybody?
No, I'd just be one more person struggling. Right. And there's that sense sometimes that people can have very unconsciously of like, well, if I'm struggling, I'm with everyone.
Right.
Right. Like shared struggle. So there's a sense of community in the struggle because sometimes that does feel somehow easier to get to than everybody thriving. And yet we have to believe that it's possible for everybody to thrive or we'll never get there.
I absolutely believe it's possible for everybody to thrive. I think a lot of things have to change. I think it's possible. And I don't think we're helping anybody when we don't thrive ourselves.
Yeah. Well, Laura, it's been such a pleasure to have you here. Any last things that you might want to share before we close up?
Besides saying I feel like we could talk for like 4 hours.
Hey, I'm an open guest for Women Uncaged.
Oh, you got it. You got it. For sure. I guess what I want to say is to any highly sensitive people who are listening to this, who are struggling around like asking for money in particular, just to know that that's kind of part of the package that we're in. This is sort of it's not yours. You don't own that necessarily. It's just something that you've inherited just by virtue of being where you are right now on the planet. And just to recognize that and to think about it from that standpoint instead of thinking there's something wrong with you. Because if there's one thing I wish all women and all marginalized people could learn to do and could learn to accept, is asking for what they need and want from a place of power rather than from a place of feeling needy. Because I think that would make a huge difference in our world if we all felt worthy of asking for what we need and want.
Beautifully said, right? Because when we make do with crumbs, we just keep the status quo.
Yes. Yep. And think it's something that we've done wrong. It's not.
Yes. Yes. All right. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you, Deanna.
It's a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, it's been wonderful.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Highly Sensitive Money. Today's conversation with Laura Gates-Lupton was both enlightening and empowering as we explored the intersection of money, feminism, and the unique challenges faced by highly sensitive individuals. Before we end, I want to shout out to Khalida Malouf, the showgirl shaman who was in an earlier episode of this podcast and who introduced Laura and I. As an HSP, it's wonderful to have a network of HSPs who help normalize all the fields and grow our network. I hope you found our conversation with Laura insightful and inspiring. Remember, understanding our financial patterns is key to making meaningful changes. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts.